Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Let's get over to the pandemic response. So the pandemic response charts, these are 4 countries I picked back in April that were emblematic of the 5 kinds of response. And the 5 responses were China was the People's Army approach. And I wasn't tracking that much because very few countries were replicating what China was doing with the massive militarized approach that was able to successfully lock it down, but huge civil liberties violations, unlikely to happen in a lot of countries. The pandemic panopticon, that is the approach used by countries that had previous experience with SARS, tend to be in Asia, South Asia. We're talking South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam. It's very driven by large amounts of data, huge amounts of testing, large amounts of data, and they simply spread the information out to everyone of where the cases are so you can self-isolate and move around them. Data privacy issues of bringing that with the US, didn't think it was very likely. I know Science Decoded, who we partner with, thinks there is a way to do it, but not a very likely solution here, which leads to the hammer and the dance. The hammer and the dance is the model you've seen in the most successful sort of non-Asian countries, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, and I use Germany as the example. So I use South Korea as the example of pandemic panopticon. I use Germany as an example of hammer and dance. And what that means is you hammer with a lockdown to build your testing and contact tracing capability. When your infections get low, you open back up. That's the dance, but you can go back to the hammer at any point. So you hammer and dance, and you go back and forth, and you use this back and forth. And then Sweden, I picked because they were the last holdout for induced herd immunity. Didn't work well for them. I got into a lot of fights over the summer with a lot of Swedish nationalists who did not like me because I was saying that their approach was not going to work. We'll see how that worked out for them. And then finally, thoughts and prayers is the US approach, which is kind of, we started out with sort of a voluntary fire break, switched to a half-hearted hammer and dance. We never really got a good hammer in place. We still don't have contact tracing. We don't really have any of the infrastructure, I'd say, to be a successful practitioner of hammer and dance. And so we're kind of in a thoughts and prayers, and I think it shows. So what I'll do now is I'll go through and demonstrate, show sort of the different responses. So the first one, these 4 countries, again, these are the 4 I've been tracking, and that's why I keep these isolated. It's not to pick on these countries particularly, it's that I picked them in the beginning and I'm staying with them. So when you're doing data analysis, you want a comparative analysis across the entire time. Some countries are doing worse than these. We'll get into those, but certainly these provide a good exemplary comparison across the different pandemic responses. So across the left, just to clear the chart on the y-axis, this is the daily new cases per capita. Right, so this is normalized. This chart is normalized by population. The population size of the country is very different, but by using per 100,000 on a 7-day, we're normalizing it and smoothing it out. It's time shifted. These are all aligned to start on the first day of their pandemic, which means it starts at different time, which is why these lines at the right end up at different times. And if you look at the colors, the hammer and the dance that I described, that's in green. That's Germany in green. Pandemic panopticon, South Korea, that's in brown. Induced herd immunity, switched to a voluntary fire break there in early November. That's Sweden, and thoughts and prayers, the United States. So you can see how Sweden and the US fared worse with both the induced herd immunity and our thoughts or prayers than either the hammer and the dance or the pandemic panopticon during this wave 1 when it finally caught up to us. Germany got hit earlier, being in Europe, but by the time it hit us, we did worse. And you can see here, this wave 1.5 was virtually only a phenomenon in the countries that didn't handle it over the summer. Germany and South Korea didn't really have here's the wave 1.5 over here. They didn't really have it. This is Sweden peaks here. Even Sweden dropped a little bit over the summer, wave 1.5 here in the US. And then finally in wave 2, as we predicted, countries that everyone was going to get hammered in wave 2. The question is whether you were prepared and the relative effectiveness by which you use this response. So it's not a question of avoiding pain, it's can you do better relative to other countries in the effectiveness of your response. And this one clearly shows that across all the responses, the pandemic panopticon continues to be the best pandemic response, bar none. South Korea has done phenomenally well. This isn't to say they don't have cases, they don't have deaths. We'll see that they do. But compared to other countries, they're doing an order of magnitude better. And Germany, relative to the United States and Sweden, even though they had a wave 2, which you can see here spiked up more than any they've had before. It's doing an order of magnitude better than either Sweden and the US. Now, Sweden their infrastructure is so poorly built at this point, which is surprising to say. They're having a hard time keeping up with testing reporting numbers, which is why you see these jagged things. When you look at the data, days go by with Sweden without reporting any numbers, and then they kind of dump it in at one day. And so that's where this choppiness comes from. But you can see the US is a little bit clearer. This is the blip for Thanksgiving. This is where wave 2 should have begun cresting for us. Then we have Thanksgiving, it goes up. Then right around the end of December, we should have crested wave 2 there, but then we had Christmas break and all the travel, and it went up. And you can see it's declining again, just like that rate of change shows, but it's still at a very high rate. We're still at, 60 cases per day per 100,000 is about 3 times as much as the summer and about 6 times as much as the early super spreader event in New York. So we are way worse off than we were last year in spring, but we're all sort of normalized to it. So it's hard to get through how we're doing. And of course, these are the cases. So when you look at cumulative death counts, this is how we're doing on overall deaths. Again, normalized per 100,000. Sweden is a much smaller country, so this is, it's only 10 million people or so. They don't have as many deaths as the US, but you can see here how doing an induced herd immunity or doing thoughts and prayers, bad pandemic response. Neither one is doing well. Now, Germany's accelerating up, and you look at this arc. The angle is about the same, but it's shifted down, and that's the difference between the pandemic response. It's not that you avoid everything, it's that you're much less per capita impact relative to the other countries that are not doing the same thing. And again, South Korea, not that it's unaffected, you can see a little bit of a climb here, but the pandemic panopticon has kept the deaths at almost, not nothing, but effectively nothing, especially compared to Germany, US, and Sweden. So those are the pandemic responses. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the Info Mullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the Info Mullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.